My name is Nora Hale, and I am 36 years old. 4 years ago, my ex-husband stood in a courtroom and told a judge that the cabin at Crestwood Lake was his. His name was on the mortgage. His name was on the insurance. His attorney had a 40-page property disclosure packet, and a confident handshake, and 12 years of our marriage reduced to a column of assets he intended to keep. What Marcus didn't know, what his attorney didn't find, what I didn't even know until 11 days before the divorce was finalized, is that the cabin was never in our marriage to divide. It had never been ours. It had been my grandmother's since 1987. Deeded into her name by my grandfather before I was born, never transferred, never touched, sitting quietly in the county recorder's office under Eleanor Hale, sole owner, like a door that had always been unlocked and nobody had ever thought to check. Before I tell you what happened when Marcus's attorney found out, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I read every one. Now let me take you back 22 years, to a summer at Crestwood Lake when I was 14 years old, and my grandfather said something I filed away and forgot for 2 decades. The summer I turned 14, my grandfather drove me to the cabin in his old green pickup, windows down, the radio playing something country and staticky. It was the first summer after my grandmother had passed, and the cabin felt different without her. Quieter, like a room where someone had turned the volume down, and nobody knew how to turn it back up. Grandpa Leonard was not a man who talked about feelings. He talked about weather, about tools, about the particular grain of the wood he'd used to build the front steps. He talked about the garden my grandmother had planted along the south wall, which he had watered all spring, without knowing quite why, as if stopping would mean something he wasn't ready to mean. We spent that week doing repairs. I handed him nails. I held the level while he checked the dock. On the last afternoon, sitting on the porch, watching the lake go silver in the late sun, he said something I didn't understand. He said, "Nora, this place is your grandmother's. Not mine, not your father's, not anyone else's." I put it in her name in 1987, and I never changed it because she was the one who loved it right. I said, "What does that mean, loved it right?" He said, "It means she knew what it was for. Some people look at a place and see what it's worth. Your grandmother looked at it and saw what it was." I nodded. I was 14. I thought he was being sentimental. He said, "When something is in someone's name, it belongs to them completely. Not to their husband, not to their children, to them. I want you to remember that." I said, I would. I didn't. Not for 22 years. Not until a paralegal named Donna Fitch pulled a 1987 deed from a county records search and called my attorney on a Tuesday afternoon in October and said, "I think you need to look at this. But before I get to Donna, I need to tell you about Marcus, and about the 12 years that made the cabin feel like his when it never was." Marcus Hale and I met at a work conference in my late 20s. He was in commercial real estate. I was in project management. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and immediately located the most important person in it. Not to be impressive, but because he genuinely found power interesting. He studied it the way some people study weather. He wanted to understand how it moved. For the first few years, that quality was interesting to me. He was decisive. He knew what he wanted. After a childhood spent in a house where nothing was ever decided without 3 rounds of negotiation and someone crying in a bathroom, Marcus's certainty felt like relief. We married in the fall. We bought a house in the city. We drove to the cabin at Crestwood Lake on summer weekends and long holidays, and the occasional random Thursday when Marcus decided he needed to think, and the cabin was where he thought best. He loved the cabin. That part was real. He repaired the dock the summer after we married, better than my grandfather ever had. He built a fireplace surround from reclaimed wood he sourced himself. He learned which window stuck in humid weather and fixed it without being asked. He made the cabin better in the way that someone makes a place better when they intend to keep it. The problem with a man who studies power is that he also studies ownership. And somewhere in the middle of our marriage, the cabin stopped being the place we went together and started being the place Marcus went to think. And the things Marcus was thinking about, it turned out, were things that didn't include me. I found out about the other woman in the second year of what I would later understand was a 3-year process of being slowly moved to the margins of my own life. Her name doesn't matter. What matters is what the discovery did to the architecture of everything I thought I understood. I filed for divorce on a Wednesday morning. Marcus was not surprised. I think some part of him had been waiting for it the way people wait for a bill they know is coming. He had a lawyer before I did. His attorney's name was Richard Cass, silver-haired, expensive. The kind of man who treated divorce proceedings the way contractors treat renovations. A job to be done efficiently, with minimal disruption to the client. The asset division process began the way it always begins. Lists, spreadsheets, a reduction of a 12-year life into columns of what he gets, and what I get, and what we sell. The cabin appeared on page 7 of his initial asset disclosure. Listed under jointly held property. Estimated value $340,000. Proposed disposition, Marcus Hale retains sole ownership in exchange for equivalent monetary compensation to opposing party. I remember reading that line. Marcus Hale retains sole ownership. Something in my chest tightened, not because I thought he was wrong, because I wasn't sure he was. The cabin had always felt like his. He had repaired it and improved it and treated it with the specific care of a man who expects to keep something. I had grown up going there and then married into going there, and somewhere in between I had let my grandmother's place become my husband's idea. I called my father that evening. I asked him about the cabin, about the deed, about whether he knew whose name it was in. He said, "It was your grandfather's place, Nora. I assume it went to your grandmother when he died, and then to your father's estate when she passed." My grandmother had died before my grandfather. I said so. My father was quiet for a moment. He said, "I honestly don't know whose name it's in. We never sorted out the paperwork after Mom died. It's possible it's still in her name. Still in her name." My attorney at the time was a careful woman named Patricia Osei. When I told her what my father had said, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "If the property was never transferred out of your grandmother's name, it was never part of your marital estate. It can't be divided." I said, "But Marcus has been paying the property taxes." She said, "Paying taxes on a property doesn't create ownership. It creates a paper trail and possibly a claim for reimbursement, but it doesn't give him title." She told me she would have a paralegal run a title search. Standard procedure. I didn't think much of it. I went home and made dinner and didn't sleep well, and assumed the search would confirm that the cabin was in my father's name, or some vague estate limbo, and that we'd fight over it anyway. The call came 11 days later. Patricia's paralegal, Donna Fitch, was a woman in her late 50s who had been doing title searches for 30 years and had the voice of someone who had seen every possible configuration of real estate mistake. She was calm, methodical, and exact. She called me directly because Patricia was in court. She said, "Miss Hale, I've completed the title search on the Crestwood Lake property." I said, "And?" She said, "The property has been titled in the name of Eleanor Margaret Hale since March 14th, 1987. There have been no transfers, no liens, no subsequent deeds recorded. The title is clean and unencumbered." I sat down on the kitchen floor. I don't know why I sat on the floor. It just seemed like the appropriate altitude for receiving that information. I said, "Eleanor Margaret Hale was my grandmother. She died in 1993. Donna said, "Yes, in the absence of a recorded transfer, the property would pass through her estate according to her will, or if she died intestate, according to state inheritance law." I said, "I don't know if she had a will." Donna said, "I'd recommend finding out." That evening I called my father back. I told him what Donna had found. He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "Your grandfather put it in her name because she didn't have anything in her own name. Everything was his, the house, the accounts, everything. He wanted her to have something that was just hers." I said, "Did she have a will?" My father said, "I don't know. We never looked." After she died, Leonard just kept going to the cabin. Nobody asked questions. I need to pause here for just a moment. If you've ever found out that something you thought was lost was actually just waiting quietly in exactly the place it had always been, tell me in the comments. Tell me what it was. I want to know. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. This story is about to move fast. The search for Eleanor Margaret Hales will began on a Thursday and ended the following Monday. My father found it in a fireproof lockbox in the back of his own storage unit, buried under 30 years of tax returns and warranty cards for appliances he no longer owned. He had not known it was there. He had not known his mother had a will at all. He called me from the storage unit. I could hear the particular acoustic of a metal box, low and reverberant, and the sound of papers being moved carefully. He said, "Nora, there's a will. It's notarized. It's dated October 1992, a year before she died." I said, "What does it say?" He read it slowly. His voice got quieter as he read. It was a simple document. 3 pages. Written in the formal language of estate planning, but clearly understood by everyone in the room when it was signed. "The cabin at Crestwood Lake," Eleanor had written, "is to pass to my granddaughter Nora Jean upon her reaching the age of 25, to be held in her name and managed as she sees fit. It is not to be sold without her consent. It is not to pass to any spouse without her explicit and separate written agreement. Not to pass to any spouse without her explicit and separate written agreement." My grandmother had written that line in 1992. I was 4 years old. She died before I was old enough to understand what a deed was. My grandfather had kept going to the cabin, and nobody had sorted the paperwork, and 30 years had passed, and now I was 36 years old, sitting in a city apartment in the middle of a divorce, and my grandmother had been protecting me from exactly this for 30 years without anyone knowing. I should have received the cabin at 25. I was now 36. The transfer had simply never happened, because nobody had found the will. Patricia Osei called me that evening. She had spoken to Donna, who had spoken to a probate attorney she knew. The situation was unusual, but not complicated. Eleanor's will was valid. The property had never legally left her estate. Because it had never been transferred to me at 25 as specified, the estate was technically still open, which meant we could petition the probate court to execute the transfer now, belatedly, and record the deed in my name. It would take approximately 3 to 4 weeks, which meant it would not be finalized before the divorce proceedings concluded. Richard Cass, Marcus's attorney, had to be notified. I asked Patricia how she thought he would respond. She said, "Richard Cass is a very good attorney. He'll look at the documents, and he'll understand immediately that the property was never part of your marital estate. He may try to argue unjust enrichment, that Marcus's improvements to the property entitle him to compensation, but the title question is clear. He won't win on ownership." I asked what Marcus would do. Patricia paused. She said, "That depends on Marcus." I knew Marcus. I had been married to him for 12 years. I knew exactly what Marcus would do. He called me the night before his attorney filed the response. I don't know how he got the information before the filing. Probably Richard Cass told him as soon as Patricia notified them. Marcus called me at 9:14 in the evening, and I let it ring twice and then answered, because I had learned years ago that not answering Marcus only postponed the conversation and made it worse. He said, "Nora." His voice was controlled, the way it got when he was managing something. I said, "Marcus." He said, "I just spoke to Richard. He told me about the deed." I said, "Then you know what it means." He said, "I know what your attorney is claiming it means." I said, "The title is in my grandmother's name. The will leaves it to me. It was never part of our assets." He said, "I paid property taxes on that cabin for 12 years. I rebuilt the dock. I put a new roof on it in 2019. That was $40,000, Nora." I said, "I know." He said, "I have 12 years of receipts." I said, "I'm sure you do." A pause. In that pause, I could hear him recalibrating. Marcus was always recalibrating. He was not a man who threw good resources after bad. He understood when a position was untenable. He said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want what my grandmother left me." He said, "The improvements. I should be compensated for the improvements." I said, "Talk to your attorney." He said, "Nora." I said, "Talk to your attorney, Marcus." I hung up. My hands were shaking. Not from anger, from the specific exhaustion of a conversation you've had 1,000 times in 1,000 different forms with the same person, and you know it's finally the last one. Richard Cass filed a motion 2 days later, not contesting the title. Patricia had been right about that. He was too good an attorney to fight the deed. Instead, he filed a claim for unjust enrichment on behalf of Marcus, arguing that the substantial improvements Marcus had made to the property over 12 years had materially increased its value, and that awarding the property to me without compensation would result in unjust enrichment at Marcus's expense. He attached 43 pages of documentation, receipts, contractor invoices, tax payment records, before and after photographs of the dock. Marcus was thorough. He had always been thorough. Patricia reviewed the motion and called me the next morning. She said, the unjust enrichment argument has some merit. Courts have awarded compensation in similar cases. We'll need to respond carefully. I asked what that meant in practical terms. She said, "It means that you will almost certainly keep the cabin. The title question is settled, but you may owe Marcus a portion of the value he added to the property." I asked how much. She said, "The property was worth approximately $180,000 in 1987 when your grandfather deeded it. It's currently appraised at $340,000. Not all of that appreciation is attributable to Marcus's improvements. The market has also moved significantly. We'll need our own appraiser to separate the market appreciation from the improvement value." I said, "And if the improvements are valued at $40,000?" She said, "Then you may need to pay Marcus $40,000 to settle his claim. Or we litigate, which costs more than $40,000. I sat with that. $40,000 I didn't have. A cabin I hadn't known was mine until 11 days ago. A grandmother who had tried to give it to me at 25, and whose instructions had been sitting in a storage unit under 30 years of warranty cards. I said, "Let's get the appraiser." The appraiser's name was Gerald Park. He was meticulous and unhurried, and he spent 2 full days at the cabin with a clipboard and a camera and a laser measuring device that he used on every surface, including several I would not have thought to measure. He produced a 27-page report. Market appreciation since 1987, $112,000. Value attributable to structural improvements made between 2010 and 2022, $31,400. The dock, which Marcus had rebuilt from scratch, accounted for $14,000 of that. The fireplace surround, which he had built himself from reclaimed wood, was beautiful, but added approximately $3,200 to the appraised value. The roof, which had genuinely needed replacing, accounted for the remaining $14,200, $31,400. Patricia presented the report to Richard Cass. There was a negotiation. Marcus wanted $38,000. His attorney had a different appraiser with a different methodology. Patricia pushed back methodically, and without emotion, the way she did everything. She was very good at her job. They settled at $33,000. I borrowed the money from my father, who had found his mother's will in a storage unit, and spent the following week in a state of quiet devastation about the 30 years that had passed while it sat there. He pressed the money on me without interest and without conditions, and said only your grandmother would want this settled. The deed transfer was recorded on a Thursday in late November. Nora Jean Hale, sole owner, Crestwood Lake, County of... I don't need to tell you the county. What matters is the name. My name. My grandmother's wish, 30 years late, and exactly on time. The divorce was finalized 2 weeks later. Marcus received a fair settlement on everything that had actually been ours. He did not contest the cabin after the settlement was paid. Richard Cass was efficient to the end. Marcus called me once more after the finalization. Not to argue. His voice was different, the recalibrating quality gone, something underneath it that I recognized from the early years of our marriage, before he had learned to manage everything including me. He said, "I really did love that cabin." I said, "I know you did." He said, "I thought it was ours." I said, "I know you did." A pause. He said, "I'm sorry. About all of it. Not just the cabin." I said, "I know." And I did know. I had known for a long time. Knowing doesn't fix everything, but it finishes things cleanly. And clean endings matter more than people say. I want to stop here for a moment. Have you ever had to borrow something back that was already yours? Have you ever had to pay for the right to keep what someone else assumed they owned? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you think my grandmother knew exactly what she was doing when she put that line in her will, not to pass to any spouse without explicit written agreement, tell me below, because I've spent 4 years thinking about that sentence, and I still haven't finished. I drove to the cabin for the first time as its legal owner on a Friday afternoon in December. Snow on the road, and the pine trees weighted with it, and the lake dark, and still under an overcast sky. I had a key that had always been mine, and now officially was. The front steps creaked the way they had always creaked. The porch door closed behind me with the particular sound of that door, and no other door in the world. Inside it smelled like wood and cold, and the particular silence of a place that has been waiting. Marcus's fireplace surround was still there. I stood in front of it for a long time. It was genuinely beautiful. The man had put real care into it. Whatever he had done to our marriage, whatever he had done to me, he had loved this place honestly and built something lasting inside it. I could hate what he did, and acknowledge what he built, and let both things be true. I lit a fire. I sat on the floor in front of it because there was no furniture yet, I hadn't brought any, and the floor was fine. I had a thermos of coffee and a notebook, and the particular feeling of someone who has arrived somewhere after a very long walk. I called my father that evening. He asked how it was. I said, "It's exactly the same." He said, "It always is." He drove up the following weekend with a truck full of furniture he'd been storing for me, pieces from my grandmother's house that he'd kept for 30 years, without quite knowing why. A rocking chair with one uneven leg that my grandfather had never gotten around to fixing. A lamp with a yellowed shade that gave off warm light. A kitchen table with 4 mismatched chairs that my grandmother had collected one by one from different yard sales because she liked each of them separately and saw no reason they couldn't belong together. We put everything in place. My father fixed the rocking chair leg with a piece of wood shim he found in the garage, the same piece, he thought, that my grandfather had cut and never used. We sat on the porch in the cold with mugs of tea and looked at the lake. He said, "She would have loved this." I said, "She planned it." He shook his head slowly. He said, "She planned it 30 years ago for a future she couldn't see." That's not planning, that's faith. I sat with that. Faith. The belief that someone would show up to the thing you prepared, even if you couldn't know when or from what direction. My grandmother had never met Marcus. She died in 1993. She could not have known I would marry someone who studied ownership. She could not have known that a divorce would come and that the cabin would be on a spreadsheet labeled jointly held property on page 7 of an asset disclosure. She could not have known any of the specific circumstances that made her 1992 will into the exact document I needed 30 years later. She just knew that a place left to a woman without protection could become someone else's. She knew that love and legal standing are different things. She knew that a name on a deed is a quiet form of power, and that quiet power, carefully placed, outlasts everything else. So she wrote the sentence, not to pass to any spouse without her explicit and separate written agreement. She wrote it in 1992 in the formal language of estate planning, and then she put it in a lockbox and trusted that it would find its way. It took 30 years. It found its way. I stayed at the cabin that night. The fire burned down to coals, and I pulled a blanket around my shoulders and listened to the lake, the particular sound of water against a dock in December, slow and cold and exactly itself. In the morning, I found something I had missed the night before. On the windowsill above the kitchen sink, half hidden behind a mason jar my grandmother used to keep wooden spoons in, there was a small photograph, black and white. My grandmother and grandfather standing on the front porch of this cabin, young, squinting into summer sun. On the back, in my grandmother's handwriting, Crestwood, 1962. First summer, she had been there from the beginning. She had loved it first. My grandfather had put it in her name because she was the one who had loved it right. And she had passed that love forward through a document nobody read for 30 years, and a line nobody noticed until it mattered completely. I put the photograph in my bag. I drove home through the snow. I called Patricia Osei to thank her, and she said, "Donna is the one who found it." And I thought about Donna Fitch in her office, with 30 years of title searches behind her, pulling a 1987 deed and reading a name and making a phone call that changed everything. I sent Donna flowers the next day. She called to thank me and said, "I've pulled a lot of titles. That one was special." She paused. "Your grandmother was smart." I said, "She was." Donna said, "She trusted someone to show up." I said yes. And then I said, "I think she trusted a lot of someone's. The attorney who drafted the will, the county clerk who recorded the deed, the storage unit that kept a lockbox dry for 30 years. And you." Donna laughed. She said, "And you. You asked the right question." I had. I had called my father on a night when everything felt like it was being taken, and I had asked, "Whose name is it in?" And that question, so simple, so easy to have never asked, had pulled a thread that went back 30 years to a man who loved a woman and wanted her to have something that was just hers. The following spring, I repaired the garden along the south wall, the one my grandmother had planted, the one my grandfather had watered for a whole season after she died without knowing quite why. It had gone wild over the decades, some plants crowding out others, some dying, some thriving without any help at all. I didn't know much about gardens. I watched videos. I bought books. I made mistakes and planted things in the wrong season and lost them and tried again. By June, there were roses along the wall that might have been my grandmother's original plants, or might have been volunteers from seeds that traveled in over the years. I couldn't know which. I decided it didn't matter. They were there now. That was what mattered. My father came for a week in July. He sat in the rocking chair on the porch and watched me work in the garden, and occasionally offered advice he prefaced with, "I don't really know anything about this, but..." and then gave actually useful advice, the way people sometimes do when they stop performing expertise and just pay attention. On the last day of his visit, he walked the property line with me the way my grandfather used to walk it with me. He showed me where the iron stakes were. Still there, older now, but solid. He pressed his thumb into the wood of the fence posts, the way my grandfather had taught me, checking for soft spots. "If it gives," he said, "it's done." I said, "You remember?" He said, "Of course I remember." We walked to the dock and stood at the end of it and looked out at the lake. The water was the particular blue of July, deep and almost still. My father said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" I said, "What?" He said, "She put that line in the will, not to pass to any spouse. She didn't know who you'd marry. She didn't know if you'd marry. She just knew that the place should stay yours." I said, "She was practical." He said, "She was loving. There's a difference." I looked at the water. He said, "Practical is protecting against something you know is coming. Loving is protecting against something you can't see yet." She did the second thing. I didn't say anything. I just stood there at the end of the dock my ex-husband had rebuilt and looked at the lake my grandmother had loved first, and thought about the long chain of people and decisions and documents and storage boxes and title searches that had delivered me to exactly this spot. I am not a woman who believes everything happens for a reason. I've seen too much go wrong for too little cause to hold that belief comfortably. But I do believe that some things are built to last, that some people, quietly, without announcement, construct the future with their hands, and then step out of the way and trust it to arrive. My grandmother built this. She built it with a sentence in a will and a deed in a county record, and the faith that whoever came after her would ask the right question. I asked the right question on a night when I was 36 years old, and my marriage was ending, and someone I trusted had spent 12 years treating something that was mine like it was his. I asked it not because I was clever or strategic, or because I knew what I'd find. I asked it because I was tired of assuming, and I needed to know what was actually true. What was actually true was that Eleanor Margaret Hale had loved this place since 1962, that my grandfather had put it in her name because she was the one who loved it right, that she had written a will in 1992 that said it should come to me, that a lockbox and a storage unit and a paralegal named Donna and a question asked on a quiet night had formed a chain that held. I keep the photograph on the windowsill now. My grandmother and grandfather, young, squinting into summer sun. Crestwood, 1962. First summer. Every time I walk past it, I think about the people who protected something before I was old enough to need protection, who planned for a future they wouldn't see, who trusted that the person coming after them would find what they'd left and know what it was for. You don't always know who's been building shelter for you. Sometimes you find out 30 years later when a paralegal pulls a 1987 deed and reads a name and makes a call, but someone built it. That's what I want to leave you with. Not the victory of keeping the cabin, not the satisfaction of Marcus's attorney discovering the title was clean and untouchable. Those things happened, and they mattered, and I won't pretend they didn't feel like something. What I want to leave you with is this. There are people who loved you ahead of the problem, who wrote the sentence before you knew you'd need it, who put the name in the right place and trusted the world to deliver it. Your job, my job, is to ask the right question at the right time and then trust what we find. If this story stayed with you, leave me a comment. Tell me about someone who built shelter for you before you knew you needed it. Tell me about the thing you found too late and too perfectly. I want to hear it. I read everything. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. There are more of these, more women, more quiet victories, more grandmothers who knew exactly what they were doing. Until next time.